Welcome to the press briefing. We have the Secretary for Food and Health, Professor Sophia Chan, the Director of Health, Dr. Constance Chan, and the Deputy for Food and Health, Mr. Howard Chan. The Secretary will tell you about the latest arrangements on the prevention and control measures against COVID-19, and then she'll take questions from the press. The Secretary, please. Good afternoon. Since the start of the COVID-19 epidemic, the SL government has been closely monitoring the development of the epidemic, and we have taken decisive and suitable measures in response to the epidemic. Now, if we look at certain indicators, for example, the School of Public Health of the Hong Kong University, they published figures on RT in April. Or from April to now, rather, the RT has remained at below 1. And that's rather reassuring. And then since the 11th of April, the number of new confirmed cases every day has remained at as a single-digit number. For 5 days, there were 0 confirmed cases. As the Chief Executive said this morning, as we cite a sign of relief, there is much more discussion on whether certain of the control measures ought to be relaxed. Well, perhaps we shouldn't just look at the local situation. We have to look at the global pandemic, which remains severe, and there are great fluctuations. Now, we don't want the situation in Hong Kong to take a sudden turn for the worse, but at the same time, we need to allow for certain adjustments. This morning, the Chief Executive in Council endorsed certain amendments to Cap 599C and also Cap 599D. That is the compulsory quarantine of certain persons arriving in Hong Kong Amendment Regulation, and the compulsory and also the disclosure of information. The measures will be extended to the 7th of June. And then the committee in Council also endorsed amendments to a series of measures to the subsidiary legislation under Cap 599. Some technical amendments will be made too. We'll be gazetting this afternoon, and the amendments will come into force at 0000 hours on the 29th of April. Now, on compulsory quarantine of certain persons arriving at Hong Kong Amendments Number 2 Regulation 2020, this is probably of greater interest to the people of Hong Kong. Here, under this regulation, that is the compulsory or quarantine of certain persons arriving at Hong Kong Amendment Number 2 Regulation 2020, what will be the arrangements? Let me explain that to you. Now, we've seen substantial improvement in the situation in the mainland. Things are now under control. Still, we need to strictly prevent imported cases from cross-boundary travel or from people with travel history, because we don't want secondary infections, so we need to remain vigilant. That's why this regulation will be extended by a month from the 7th of May 2020 to the 7th of June 2020. And also, we have joint prevention and control efforts with the mainland and Macau authorities. In the light of the latest development of the COVID-19 epidemic, various measures have been taken by these other authorities, and then the amendment will empower the Director for Health to vary the compulsory 14-day quarantine arrangement by cancelling the quarantine orders on travellers arriving from the mainland and Macau if they can fulfill certain criteria. The government is in discussion with the relevant authorities and will announce the details later. Now, we want to gradually resume economic activities and the flow of people. The amendment regulation will also empower the Chief Secretary for Administration to designate certain persons fulfilling certain criteria. There are two types. First, persons who need to travel to Hong Kong for the purpose of receiving nursery, kindergarten, primary or secondary education at any school registered under the Education Ordinance Cap 279 in Hong Kong, or for the provision of such education of their safe travelling, including cross-boundary students and related personnel and service providers. And B, persons having manufacturing operations or business activities or providing professional service, and the travelling is considered to be in the interest of Hong Kong's economic development. There could be exemption for these people from the compulsory quarantine requirement. And then there is the CAP 599D, Prevention and Control of Disease Disclosure and Information Regulation. This enables the health health officers empowered to require a person to disclose or furnish any information relevant to the handling of a state of the public health emergency, such as travel history. The relevant power is extended to other medical practitioners who would have encountered with a person involved in such public health emergency. As Hong Kong may remain in a state of public health emergency, so we will therefore amend the regulation to extend the validity period from the 7th of May 2020 to the 31st of August 2020. There are a few other technical amendments. Perhaps I could go through them with you as well. One, we will amend the regulation to empower designated officers other than the Director of Health to perform a function under Schedule 2 of the Prevention and Control of Disease Prohibition on Group Gathering Regulation Cap 599G to serve demand notice for failure to pay the fixed penalty. It is just to streamline the process. And then the World Health Organization has named this disease the coronavirus disease 2019, or COVID-19 in short. And the virus has been named as Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2 SARS-CoV-2 in short. So because of the names made by the WHO, we are also making corresponding amendments to the relevant regulations. Now you see the epidemic seems to have eased in Hong Kong, but the global pandemic remains severe and the situation is not yet stable. And we're seeing quite a number of new confirmed cases in various countries every day. And the total number of confirmed cases has exceeded 3 million. There are over 210,000 deaths. So I hope the public will remain vigilant. Please do not let down your guard for now. Otherwise, the hard work and the achievements we've made so far may go to waste. The SO government will, of course, continue to monitor closely the developments of the epidemic around the world. We will do risk assessment. And in the light of the circumstance, we will consider the whole picture and then make or adjust our prevention and control measures as necessary. Thank you. Now the floor is open to questions. Please use the microphone and please identify the organization you represent. Please limit yourself to 3 questions each. Thank you. On the 4th row, the 3rd person there, the lady in black.
Amateur Radio. Right here. Just now you remarked that the Chief Secretary is empowered to offer exemption for business travel or those providing professional services on the quarantine arrangements. May I know, does that mean that those groups of people are not subject to the 14-day mandatory quarantine? do they need to submit more information to prove that they are not infected? If not, would that turn into a loophole? And how can you prove that their identity will not be abused? And some are concerned that the mainland business visa are approved on a very lax basis. And how do you keep the situation under control? Thank you for your question. And under 599G, we offer certain type of exemptions. For example, the cross-border truck drivers, and each day they are transporting goods and live produce, and which serve a vital function for Hong Kong, so they must be catered for. Our proposal is that the exemption is extended to 2 more groups of people. First, cross-border boundary students and the relevant personnel and service providers. And for your question, that those considered to be interests of Hong Kong economic development and providing professional services and business activities and manufacturing operations. In this context, I believe that the CEDB have noticed that the sectors have provided feedback and hope that the government can relax the restrictions. And we also need to seek the approval of the Chief Secretary before we are proposing this exemption. And for the exempted persons, so what kind of criteria do they have to fulfill? And on the allowed duration of stay, and what preventive measures must they undertake? That relevant policy bureau are currently hashing out the details, and they also need to consult the sectors. And when the details come ready, and they will be announced. So today at the Executive Council, we have discussed the scope of exemption, which include these 2 groups, while the details are being continuously discussed by the policy bureaus, and afterwards, and they will be announced in due course. The lady in the first row. Now news. Recently, in Guangdong province, there were still some local infection cases. And why do you assess that it's safe to allow mainland residents into Hong Kong, especially the cross-boundary students may not have as good hygiene? And are you concerned about the risk of imported infection? And this morning, the CE claims that next Monday, they will reopen some LCDs facilities, for example, libraries. Would that become inconsistent with the group gathering? And how do you ensure that there will be no gathering more than 4 and being 1.5 meters apart? And next, on police enforcement, and the police have warned the citizens in City Plaza that are gathering for the common purpose and may be prosecuted. And how would it lead to the infection? Have the police interpreted the legislative intent? First, on the local situation, well, the mainland situation, and the Center for Health Protection have been closely monitoring the mainland and the Macau, and also the global situation in preserving the risk assessment. Our view is that the overall mainland situation, on one hand, we're keeping closely in view. On the other hand, looking at their numbers, we would see that they have the situation under control. Besides this, we also understand that the mainland quarantine policy are very strict. And under the joint infection control mechanism, and also on this cooperation with Macau and the mainland, and how do we complement each other measures, that will also require a discussion on all three sides. Now we see that on the 7th of May that the regulation would expire, so that we suggest that we will extend it for 1 month. That will allow us more time to explore, look in his situation on taking the next step forward. Well, in the course of discussion on details like whether what are the mainland requirements and what are our requirements, for example, our 14-day home quarantine, and the mainland also requested a 14-day quarantine for all arrivals on to Shenzhen and Guangdong province, and also have this testing requirement. So especially the Department of Health, when amending the regulations, the Director of Health is empowered to repeal certain quarantine orders. So that we call it a suppression and lift order. So because it very much depends on the state of the epidemic. On the resumption of work, as we all know that 599F and 599G so that they will expire at around the 5th of May. So at this stage, they're still in effect. However, for the purpose of work, that was already exempted under the regulation. Well, while these regulations are still in effect, that the public will continue to be mindful of this. And for the 599G enforcement, yesterday the Secretary of Justice and this morning the Chief Executive had already replied to the press question. Well, if we look at the legislative intent, why do we institute a group gathering ban, or why not allow public gathering of more than 4 in a public place? From the public health perspective, we hope to minimize the risk of transmission in a community. While the epidemic still persists, we took the view that minimizing group gatherings as the regulation and the intent and the objective of the regulation. On initiating prosecution, first we need to check against the legislative intent and also the relevant provision on how this is written. And earlier, the Secretary of Justice had explained about it. Next question. The 4th row, the lady in white.
This is Lillian of South China Morning Post. 3 questions. Firstly, what are your considerations for the minor relaxation on the border control measures? As medical experts actually suggest to wait after lifting up some of the social distancing measures. And it should be after that we should consider any border adjustments. So have you seek any opinions from the expert team, and have you put into consideration of the possible second wave of cases in the mainland? And also, since some cities of the Guangdong province has enforced a 14 days quarantine measures for all entry, so are there any communications between these governments? Are these 2 groups you mentioned exempt as well? And thirdly, for those businesses that currently forced to close, are you considering lifting some of the measures after May 7? Can you briefly mention what kind of businesses will you consider? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your 3 questions. First of all, I think the consideration of our compulsory quarantine of certain persons arriving in Hong Kong, that is the allowing some exemptions in the CAP 599C. In fact, in the current legislation, there are already exemption categories. With the development of the epidemic, and also we receive requests from different people, as well as the society is gradually returning to some of these normal services. We recommend in the EXCO this morning, and it has passed the EXCO, which we will gazette very soon within today, is that for CS, the Chief Secretary to exempt persons fulfilling for the following criteria from the compulsory quarantine, which I think you have mentioned. First is the persons who need to travel to Hong Kong for the purpose of receiving nursery, kindergarten, primary or secondary education at any school registered under the Education Ordinance, CAP 279 in Hong Kong, or for the provision of such education or safe traveling, including cross-border boundary students, as well as related personnel and service providers. And also another category is persons who have manufacturing operations or business activities, or providing professional services, and their traveling is considered to be in the interest of the Hong Kong's economic development. First of all, I think in our communication with our Guangdong and also Macau counterparts, there is this continuous communication between, for example, our Department of Health with the mainland authorities, and also the Food and Health Bureau with our counterparts in the mainland authorities, in the interest of working together with them and also synchronize our quarantine measures. It is important for us to work together with them, because as you have already mentioned, in the Guangdong, our Guangdong counterparts have actually got the quarantine policy of quarantining people who enter for example, enter Shenzhen or Guangdong province to have a mandatory quarantine for 14 days. So Hong Kong also have our own quarantine measures. So it is important for us to work together and see how we can synchronize our quarantine measures. Regarding the epidemic situation in China, as you may well know from the figures or the new confirmed cases every day, that they are more or less under control. Of course, they have some new cases every day, not a big number, but most of their cases again is from the imported cases. Our Department of Health, Center for Health Protection, is actually monitoring the situation every day in terms of the global situation as well as the mainland epidemic situation. So I think in this context, in the context of returning the society, returning into normal, I think the students, especially the cross-border students, this is one category that we have recommended that the Education Bureau would need to look into the details. If there is a resumption of school one day, well, the resumption of school hasn't happened yet. But if this happened one day, then what are we going to do with these cross-border students? What are some of the necessary measures that need to take into consideration in order for this particular group to be exempted, by our Chief Secretary? So I think these are some of the issues. Regarding your question about lifting, some of the measures, I think we would continue to monitor the situation, not only the local situation, as the local situation, we have zero confirmed cases for over 5 days, but the global situation is still quite severe, as well as there are new confirmed cases every day, and the global situation, we now have over 3 million confirmed cases, and there are new confirmed cases every day. So therefore, I think we have to continue to monitor the situation, both local, global, as well as the expectations and also the society as a whole, all the factors that I think the Chief Executive has mentioned this morning to come up with recommendations in the near future. Thank you.
下一條，嗰邊第二行再
Next, on the second row, the lady in grey. I'm from Commercial Radio. About relaxing cap 599C. Have you done any assessment? Let's say we give exemptions to cross-boundary students and business travelers. How many arrivals are we talking about every day? And would you set a quota? And have you consulted the experts? If these people don't need to undergo mandatory quarantine, would they first be required to do a test at the Asia World Expo? Do you have any initial ideas, just to give us assurance? And second question about the gathering ban. What about relaxing the number? Maybe for entertainment venues that are not so risky, would they be allowed to resume service first? And finally, on protests and demonstrations, can you say a bit more about common purpose? What if someone just walks past and then shouts a slogan, and then could that person be prosecuted as well, or do you leave it to the police? Thank you. First, about students or the proposed exemption categories. Now, for CAP 599C, it will expire on the 7th of May. So at the Executive Council meeting, there was need to endorse certain arrangements. Say if we need time to have discussion with the mainland authorities on our joint prevention and control efforts, and we have to discuss with them on how we work with the or synchronize the measures with the Guangdong authorities, Shenzhen authorities, or Macau authorities, and that may take a bit of time. That's the first consideration. Now, if we put in place certain measures just on our own, that will actually just lead to inconvenience. So we need to have a joint prevention and control effort as the basis. So we could perhaps synchronize our quarantine measures on the exemption categories. Actually, under CAP 599C, there are already certain groups exempted. For example, cross-boundary truck drivers. So because we need to keep certain services going on, and so we have been including exempted groups. And we need to look at figures too. This morning, the Chief Executive mentioned that under CAP 599C, there are over 90,000 exempted, and there's not a single confirmed case, so that's perhaps a reference point for us. Well, these two exemption groups that we're proposing, now would there be certain requirements? Do the people in these groups have to meet those requirements before they are given the exemption? Well, then it's up to the relevant policy bureau. For example, the Education Bureau in relation to cross-boundary students. As for business travelers, that is commercial activities, that will be, of course, under the jurisdiction of the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau. So the reference bureau will be looking at the details. Of course, they will work together with the Department of Health in fleshing out the details. For example, what the duration of stay for these people, certain personal hygiene requirements, and so on. So Definitely, I'm sure the Revenue Bureau will be looking into all these issues. And now we're extending the regulation by months, and so within that time, we're going to work out all these arrangements. Your other question is on CAP 599F and CAP 599G. You've asked questions about the two regulations. For CAP 599G, perhaps I could invite Mr. Howard Chan, our Deputy Secretary, to explain the legislative intent to you. I think what is most important is when we enforce the regulation, there are different colleagues from different departments who may be in charge of enforcing the regulation, CAP 599G, but definitely they go by the legislative intent. As for CAP 599, we're aware of the demands of the public and the relevant sectors, and some sectors have suggested that they could do more in hygiene measures to try to prevent infection. Now, the various sectors have been supporting our fight against epidemic, and we appreciate that. Now, the measures will be enforced until the 7th of May. Before then, we will be reviewing the overall situation. And as the Chief Executive mentioned this morning, we're going to look at the situation in Hong Kong and other places, and then based on those factors, we will come to a decision. And then we will announce this decision as soon as possible. Now, can I invite Mr. Chen to talk about 599G?
局長喺呢個禁止群組聚集，即係599G 呢個規例咧，其實成個精神咧就希望能夠透過呢一個嘅規例咧，能夠避免人群嘅聚集。因為喺呢段時間，我哋希望咧就係減少嗰個傳播嘅風險。咁所以咧就
To minimize transmission risk. So in these regulations, that a group gathering should not exceed a group of 4. And that's the general premises. And more on the enforcement, and under 599G to empower 7 government departments to enforce this regulation. And we also issued enforcement guidelines, and they're simply adhering to the guidelines and the regulations and enforcing the law. And our definition on group gathering, when a group of people that would gather for a common purpose, that whether it's counted as gathering, it really depends on the individual circumstances. For example, whether this gathering is pre-organized and whether interaction with those who gathered. And for example, while you're queuing for a bus, that may not be fall in the definition of a gathering. The government departments will follow on the regulations and a guideline to enforce the law. Last 2 questions. We'll take another English question. The gentleman on the 3rd row.
Thank you, Richard from RTHK. Can I just ask about the exemptions under CAP 599C, particularly that point about people engaged in sort of business travel in the interest of Hong Kong's economic development? That seems very, very broad. Do you think that's a bit risky, considering you're also calling for the whole city to maintain its vigilance, especially with the virus all around the world? And secondly, you mentioned the figure since April 11th and how there have been no cases on about 5 days, I think. For purely sort of local issues, what criteria will you be considering when you want to relax things like the maximum number of people allowed in a public gathering?
Thank you for your question. First of all, is the exemption. The exemption about people having manufacturing operations or business activities, or people who want to provide professional services and their traveling is considered to be in the interest of Hong Kong's economic development. I think what I've read out earlier has already alluded to is not anyone who is in the business sector. It's really those traveling is considered to be in the interest of the Hong Kong economic development. As far as the criteria and also the details is concerned, our CEDB Bureau is actually working out the details of the exemption. Of course, the final decision is to be given by the Chief Secretary, but the details, as far as the criteria is concerned, for example, who can apply, what are some of the operation details, what is considered to be manufacturing operations or business activities, or what are some of the hygiene or measures that they have to abide to, or the period of stay, etc., etc. I think there are a number of details that I think the relevant bureau is going to work out before putting the application to the Chief Secretary for the final decision. As far as the risk is concerned, of course, our Department of Health and perhaps I think the Director of Health, Dr. Constance Chan, can give her take on the assessment of the China latest situation. As far as the risk assessment is concerned, of course, we will monitor the situation very closely every day. In fact, the Center for Health Protection is doing it every day. But then in the context of returning the services, for example, the Chief Executive have already said this morning that we're going to gradually, return, the civil service is going to return its services to the community gradually. So in this spirit, actually, there are many other communication and also services or activities that Hong Kong and the mainland has stopped in the past in terms of the epidemic situation. And so therefore, under the CAP 599C, there are actually already exemption categories. But then this time we are expanding the exemption categories into two more categories. One is the cross-border students, and second is the manufacturing operations or business activities. So therefore, I think on the one hand, we will continue to monitor the risk. On the other hand, I think the relevant bureau will work out criteria in terms of the exemption so that the exemption would be relevant as well as appropriate. Perhaps Dr. Constance Chan can say a little bit about the risk assessment of the China latest situation.
Right now, actually, both in the mainland and in Hong Kong, we are facing and seeing cases which comes from imported sources, mainly from returnees coming back from overseas countries. And also locally, and also in the mainland, they do have some local cases. In considering whether any restrictions would be lifted, we will be making reference to the World Health Organization's criteria, which include 6, namely, whether transmission is controlled, secondly, whether the health system capacities are in place to detect, to test, isolate, and treat every case and trace every contact. And number 3, whether outbreak risks are minimized in specialized settings such as healthcare facilities and nursing homes. And number 4, whether preventive measures are in place in special settings like workplaces, schools, etc. And the 5th point, very important, is whether importation risk can be managed. And lastly, whether the communities are fully educated and engaged and empowered to adjust to the new norm. So I would like to actually elaborate one of the proposed amendments in the new amendment regulations. It empowers the Director of Health to lift the quarantine order in specific situation. As you are aware, currently in the mainland, in Macau, and also in Hong Kong, people returning into these 3 areas are all required to undergo a compulsory 14 days quarantine. And so there may be a situation where a person has fulfilled a quarantine of 14 days in, for example, mainland or in Macau, and when that person returns to Hong Kong, he or she will still be subjected to 14 days quarantine under Cap 599C. In other words, that person will be subjected to a total of 28 days quarantine. So having considered the situation, we have conducted discussion with Guangdong and also with Macau to examine how the quarantine arrangements can be take into account each other's practices. So preliminary, we are in support of a direction that if a person fulfills a 14-day period quarantined in either the mainland or in Macau, and then he or she returns to Hong Kong, subject to certain conditions, that is, if that person completes the quarantine and within the next day he or she returns to Hong Kong, he or she will be given a quarantine order. But if he is able to provide a specimen, a deep throat saliva specimen, and the test result turns out to be negative, in that case, the 14 days quarantine period in Hong Kong can be shortened. So this is one of the measures under the new amendment regulations that would be put in place. But the details would have to be worked out in details with the mainland and also with the Macau Health Authority.
好，最後一條。第二
Last question. Over there, the second row, the gentleman, please. I'm from the Stand News. First question about the details of 599G. Is Taiwan included for the exemption of the two groups? And it says here, in the interest of Hong Kong's economic development, and those involving in operations, business activities, or providing professional service. Apart from so how can anyone just claim to be in one of this group? How do you actually prove that these people are as defined? Second question, the Secretary wants Hong Kong people to remain vigilant for a little longer, but you are relaxing 599C. So is there inconsistency in government policies? How come you say we shouldn't lift the control in certain aspect, but now you're lifting the control under this regulation? Now when there's no new confirmed case, there is no longer daily press briefing. Would you undertake that even if the epidemic is easing, you will still come out regularly to update us on the latest situation? Thank you. On Cap 599C and the overall arrangement for Cap 599C, as you know, the validity period is up to the 7th of May under the current arrangement. But if we look at the epidemic in Hong Kong, the mainland, and around the world, things have become very different compared to 3 months ago. That's why now we need new arrangements too, whether it be a suppress or lift. Because as the Chief Executive mentioned this morning, we need to adopt the suppress and lift strategy in response to the epidemic. So that means that certain times we may have to either tighten or relax our control measures in the light of the epidemic. Now, under 599C, we are proposing certain arrangements. And actually, it would take us a bit more time to put in place the arrangement. That's why we've extended 599C by months to the 7th of June. And as I mentioned earlier, on the basis of joint prevention and control measures with the mainland and Macau authorities, we are proposing these arrangements. And then you asked about Taiwan. Well, here we are primarily talking about the mainland and Macau. So it's a joint effort among the Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau authorities, because there is more frequent interaction among these three places. And then on the mainland, they have a new control or quarantine measures, and these measures are rather stringent. So that's why we need to synchronize the effort among us. And as the Director of Health mentioned, as we have discussion with them, now currently the mainland has a 14-day mandatory quarantine, and in Hong Kong we also have 14-day mandatory quarantine. That means it will be a total of 28 days of quarantine for persons involved. And so the Director has said just now, if someone already has undergone 14 days of mandatory quarantine and there is proof of that, then we could do a test in Hong Kong, and if the person's tested negative, then we could shorten the quarantine period. But on the actual detailed arrangement, we need to continue our discussion with the mainland authorities on the basis of joint prevention and control measures. And second question. We are now extending the scope of exemption a little under a mechanism. We're including two other groups. One group is cross-boundary students and the related persons and the service providers, and the other group is persons having manufacturing operations or business activities or providing professional service, and so they could enjoy exemption. I see that you have certain concerns, and you ask who exactly will be given the exemption, and you ask if there will be certain criteria to be met, or is anybody eligible. Well, the relevant policy bureau, such as the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau, will have to continue discussion with the relevant sectors, and then they will have to decide which types of personnel would would fit the description, and what would be the duration of stay, whether the persons involved have to undertake to practice certain personal hygiene measures, and so on. So there are a lot of details to be fleshed out by the Commerce and Economic Bureau in discussion with the other authorities, and then the Chief Secretary will make the final decision. So there is need for more time to work out this arrangement. Your third question, is about press briefings and how do we disseminate information to the public. Now we've remained transparent and open in disseminating information. The Center for Health Protection and the Department of Health have a website. The government's also set up a special or dedicated COVID-19 website to release date figures and other information, about public education and so on. And then, of course, the daily press briefing will give you an opportunity to ask questions about confirmed cases and the relevant policies. Now, there will be the suppress and lift arrangement for different measures, or there could be adjustment to measures. In line with the principle of openness and transparency, we will continue to disseminate information on the various and appropriate channels. Thank you. Sorry, speaker's not coming through.
係凌晨開始生效嚇，咁
Yes, it will start from midnight. We will first focus on the arrangements involving Guangdong, Macau, and Hong Kong, since we have joint prevention and control measures. So we first look at the quarantine measures involving these 3 places. And of course, we'll continue to monitor the arrangements in other places. Taiwan, you mentioned that as one place, but there are other places as well. For example, there are other provinces on the mainland. Or if we extend it, we could extend it to different places around the world, but we'll have to consider the epidemic at those places in our consideration. Thank you. That's the end of the press briefing. Or perhaps Mr. Chen, Mr. Howard Chen, the Undersecretary, could still say a few words.
呢嘅修訂規例
For 599C, amendment with such a regulation on the midnight today. However, the exemption, you need to apply for it. And for the latest 2 group of exemptions, they belong to a certain groups or certain individuals. The application details will be hammered out by the Bureau after consulting the relevant sector before we can outline the criteria. Even though the amendment will take effect, however, we have to wait for the application mechanism to be launched. Then, before we can open application, we hope to roll out this application mechanism very soon. Thank you.